Stillwater there. So on Sundays last year, I was opening the building. It's a very nice museum if you'd ever like to come visit. It's the first Sunday of the month. So I was there on my usual duty, and Larry Brasher, Dr. Brasher, came in with Louisa. I didn't know them at all. And so we started talking, and we were walking around looking at different things, and we looked at a photo. I had put up some photos of people from town to illustrate some of the artifacts. So there is next to the children's clothing, there's a christening dress, and I had found an old picture of my godmother, Ethel Toland. Some people might know the Tolands. And she was wearing, of course, she's not yet a year old, wearing this christening dress to illustrate the real dress that we had. And so I said, oh, that's my godmother, Ethel Toland. And then Larry said, oh, Ethel Toland. He said, well, Cookie Passman told me that Ethel Toland has these very old apple trees in the back of her house. So I thought, well, yeah, that's my mother. So that was the beginning of it. And we stayed in touch over the year about all different things, apples and many other things as well. And so I'm so happy that Larry was aware of the stories he had written and the many things that he's written. I've given a little bio just so you can see many, many, many things. It's endless that he's done. And Louise as well. And so from there, we just were able to work out something very quickly with the Methodist Church, and Pastor Nancy was so easy to work with and cooperative, and I'm really grateful for that. So hopefully more in the future. Hope you enjoy the stories, and we can, at the end, I don't know if there's time for questions or maybe not. Anyway, enjoy the stories, and next time you can bring some of your own too. Looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Louise and Daniel and I are just delighted to be here today and to see so many familiar faces and friends. It's just really wonderful. And a special thanks to Michelle Bosfer, Shelley, who really was the force behind today, and also to Pastor Nancy for hosting it. We just appreciate it so much. And for you all being here, it's such a gracious response. We're really touched. I'm going to tell stories today for 1 hour, and if anybody needs to leave, I won't be the least offended. But I'm going to tell stories for 1 hour, and then I'm going to quit. I don't know how many I'll get to tell during that time. And we're going to end up with a song we're all going to sing. And these stories are stories that I wrote. Most of them, there are a couple that but most of them I wrote for the Harmony Hill newsletter about 20 or 25 years ago. And that was 30 years after we lived here in Stillwater. So we're talking about things that happened 50 years ago. So I'm going to tell mostly stories from those newsletters. A couple that aren't. But in this case, all the names of the characters are real. And I always say I'm not telling pastoral confidences. I'm not telling stories of greed and jealousy and the dark side of human nature in these stories.
Lost shots.
The first one, and these stories have little titles, and they'll give you a clue as to what I'm going to be talking about. But the first one is a snow day at church. And the first things that you need to know are that I loved snow, and I loved having Sunday dinner at Foster and Olive Honest's house. They lived right opposite Keeney's Mill. The house is no longer there. It was bought up by Green Acres and demolished. But they were an institution in the 1960s. Wonderful people. And I had an agreement with them that I had Sunday dinner with them every Sunday, unless I was invited out to someone else's house for Sunday dinner. So that was wonderful. And I also loved snow. I was raised in the suburbs of New York City, and we would listen intently every morning, every school morning, to John Gambling on WOR. And he would make all the announcements of school closings. And in the warmth and drizzle of close to New York City, we would hardly ever close. But in Sussex County, they always closed. We were so jealous as kids. And so when I moved to Stillwater as a rookie pastor in 1971, even as a forward to the snow up here. So one morning, well, let me go back to the Hannesses. The Hannesses' dinner invitations were wonderful. Olive was a wonderful cook, and she would ply me with seconds and thirds, and then there would always be a sumptuous dessert. And there were always interesting people there. Not only her family, but guests. Her family would always be there. Ted Brush was her brother, and he was a marvelous local historian. And his father, his and Olive's father, Mr. Bush, and Mr. Brush that is, he was in his late 80s, and his nickname was Farfar. He was a member of the Presbyterian Church, and of course I was a pastor here. And so every Sunday, I would get insider commentary on what was going on in the Presbyterian Church. And the Hannesses were out in the community, and they would tell stories, local color stories about other people. They had moved up from the city about 30 years beforehand, so they had sort of a merry and interesting perspective on what was going on in Stillwater. So all that is to say, I learned a lot at Sunday dinner at the Hannesses. Well, one Sunday morning in January, I woke up to what for me was fairly deep snow. It was about 8 inches deep by my standards. And Catherine Huff, who was the organist here at the time, called me up and said, well, she wasn't going to try to get out of her driveway. And so I thought about it. Snow looked deep, and I called off church. And I talked with Olive, and Olive said, well, come on over if you can, and we'll have dinner early. Well, I got out of the church lot without too much trouble, and soon I was in the happy, cozy company of the Hannesses having a delicious dinner. But then, the Goulds stopped in. Blair's here today. The Goulds stopped in, and Blair's mother was French. And for those of you who remember her, she had a very animated conversation and a wonderful French-American accent. And she told about how Roger and she had gotten out of their driveway with great difficulty and had driven over here to church. And they had driven over here to church, and when they got here, they found the Callanians had walked all the way over Nelson's Hill in the snow, and they were here waiting for the service.
We sure were.
Yeah, but where was the minister? Where was the minister? Nowhere in sight, not even at the parsonage. Well, a few days later, a friend told me that he had been speaking with Foster Hannes, and Foster had remarked to him, you know, if Larry could drive here for dinner, he could have held church. So that was the last time I ever canceled church. It was Jesus who said in the Gospel of Matthew, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of that. Now I want to go back to Ted Brush, and this is not something I wrote for the Harmony Hill newsletter, but Ted was a marvelous local historian. He was superb, very honest local historian. And I understand just recently, unfortunately, the time capsule, which was placed in the wall there below the Presbyterian Church, that it was burglarized, that it was ripped out and it disappeared. Yeah, it's a shame. It was placed in there with great ceremony in the second half of the 1960s when Walter Cook was the pastor there, and I believe it was the 200th anniversary of the Presbyterian Church, which was the oldest congregation here at the time. So the time capsule was there. Well, the church, before that time capsule, 2 or 3 years, they had asked Ted Brush to write a history of the church, and he very meticulously studied the history, and he discovered in the course of his research that there were several Presbyterian people in the town in the 18th and early 19th century who had owned slaves, as in the rest of New Jersey. Well, he had this in his history, and apparently there were several members of the Presbyterian session that were not happy that this was mentioned in the official history, and so they asked, really insisted that Ted leave that part of the history out. They did not want that. Well, Ted was not pleased with that. He was not pleased with the whitewashing of the history. And Ted was also involved in the ceremony of placing that time capsule in the Presbyterian Church retaining wall there. He knew where the box was, waiting to be sealed up for 100 years. Now, of course, it's been burglarized, and the theft, I'm sure, looked through the materials, and maybe the thief was a bit surprised. Ted knew where that box was, and he knew the contents of the box. It had a Bible, it had a Presbyterian hymn book, some of the latest Presbyterian literature and publications, a list of the members of the church at the time. Very pious, churchy literature in there. Ted knew where the box was, and the night before it was to be sealed up for 100 years, he slipped something into the bottom of the box. It was the latest issue of the Playboy magazine. So we can think with a bit of mirth about the thief who discovered this, probably looking for gold or jewels, and found the pious literature that then an interesting magazine. Well, this one's called an after-dinner talk. The first Sunday in July 1971 was my debut in Stillwater and Swartzwood, two churches yoked together. But 3 Sundays later, I was on my way to the then Soviet Union. In divinity school, I sang in the Yale Russian chorus, and we had been slated for a tour of the Soviet Union long before I was engaged to be the pastor of this church. So in my first interview here, I told the pastor parish committee about it, and everything was good to go. They understood that I was going to be gone for 3 weeks, just 2 or 3 weeks after I had arrived here. Now, it was still the Cold War, and making the trip to Russia was not a common event. And there was a lot of talk about it among the church members and in the community. After a couple of Sundays, Pearl Monroe, Craig's grandmother, told me that she had heard a rumor that I wasn't coming back after the trip. I thought maybe wishful thinking. But people were a lot more apprehensive about my going off to Russia. And on the Sunday, the very Sunday that I boarded the plane mid-afternoon, I preached here, and everybody knew that I was boarding a plane for Russia mid-afternoon. But on her way out of church, Lulu Kastner asked me to stop by her home after church. I thought it must be something really urgent. Everyone knew that I had an afternoon flight. So that afternoon in her living room, she said, "Watch out for those communists. You can't trust them." She wanted me to know that. After my trip, my Russian experiences provided, as you can imagine, wonderful sermon illustrations about the persistence of religion in the Soviet Union under severe persecution. And quite a few of the churches and clubs in the county requested my slideshow, my photographic slideshow after I got back. And of course, the central theme of my slideshow was always the courage of the Russian church under persecution. Well, one night in February, I was invited to talk to a local civic group. It was down at the Hardwick House at Hardwick Corners to show my slides and talk about my trip. Well, they met for dinner there, and when I arrived early, most of the members of the club were still at the bar. So I sidled up to Michael, began talking to him, and I struck up a conversation. And so he said to me, "Yeah, so you're the speaker tonight, eh?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Oh, Stillwater." He said, "What's your topic?" I said, "Well, I'm showing slides from my trip to the Soviet Union this summer." He said, "Oh," "I'll look forward to it. You know, I don't agree with most of what those Reds do, But there's one thing I've got to give them credit for. They've done a great job of getting rid of religion. Right, I said. At the end of the program, he made a point to come over and shake my hand. Enjoyed your talk, he said. Well, this one is a scare in the cemetery. The first time I saw the cemetery out here in front of the parsonage, I fell in love with it. A handsomely laid limestone wall surrounding it, capped by a nice slate cap, mossy, sloping gravestones overgrown with myrtle and spurge and roses. It wasn't beautifully manicured then. It was pretty grown up with those things. Most of all, I loved the maples, giants hugging the cemetery in solemn rows, planted there before most of the people were. The scene was lovely at any time of the year. Some thought it was pretty spooky. The story was that Carl Curtin, my immediate predecessor, invited a friend to preach for him one Sunday when Carl had to be away. And the story was that Carl gave him the key to the parsonage to stay at the parsonage overnight, Saturday night, and the friend supposedly arrived with the key, took one look at the cemetery, and drove back to Newton and got a motel room for the night. He was spooked. Well, Jim White and I had talked about maple sugaring. And I think it was Leela Emmons. Leela Emmons told me that her neighbor Stan Kabeski had just built a new sugar house over there. And I called Stan, and he came to look at the trees, and he said, "These are great. You know, trees with a leaf crown like this will produce a lot of sugar. The average sugar maple produces 40 to 60 gallons of syrup from, a gallon of syrup from 40 or 60 gallons of sap." Well, these trees were extraordinary. But we made a deal. I would collect the sap in buckets and pour them into milk cans, and then later that day, Stan Kabeski would come and take the milk cans to a sugar house and boil them down, and I would get a percentage of the syrup. Well, these trees were terrific. They gave an average of 1 gallon of syrup for every 30 gallons of sap. It was first rate, too. Grade A fancy. Now, people saw me collecting buckets, and they were interested, of course. It was the first maple sugaring that had been done in the village in quite some time. Ellen Nelson, Edwin's mother, said that people were saying that the only thing I get out of those trees was whiskey because there were so many of the Mays family there. Somebody else saw me lugging buckets one day and asked me, is the water off in the parsonage? Well, one afternoon, no one else saw what happened. I wore gloves to carry the buckets early in March, but one day toward the end of the month, it had gotten pretty warm. And so I took my gloves off and placed them like this on the top of a gravestone. So here were the gloves. And forgot them. And several days later, I was lifting a full bucket off of a tree when out of the corner of my eye, I saw 2 hands clutching the gravestone, and that bucket hit the wall. Never made it to the sugar house. Well, this one is called All Creatures Great and Small, or November Vermin. We were never alone in the parsonage, Louisiana, especially after the November chill. The parsonage provided warm lodging for a troop of uninvited guests. The bats in the attic were the exception. As soon as it got chilly, the bats, and there were hundreds of them in the attic, the bats left. And that allowed us, in the wintertime, to hang our laundry up there in the attic. We knew it was cold when our underwear froze. But the winter boarders that came in more than made up for the absence of the bats, and they were not as good tenants. They were noisy and greedy, and sometimes they were destructive. One fall, mice pilfered all of the lima beans that we were drying on newspapers for our next year's garden. We found them in strange, hidden places in the house, odd places. One time, a little kangaroo mouse came out of the woodwork and ate a lima bean perched on Louise's foot. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and Louise loves animals, and she allowed it to sit there and eat the lima bean. But even Louise's lenient attitude toward mice changed one Thanksgiving morning when she discovered that the pumpkin pie she had left out on the table to cool the night before, was decorated with a perfect circle of not what you think, tiny mouse footprints. The rat was another story. We had our own potatoes, and we had bushel baskets of potatoes stored in the basement. And there was a rat that began to come in and gnaw on the potatoes, and it was enormous. It was as big as a cat, it really was. And when the rat and I saw each other, we both ran. It was huge. Not long after that, John Kieran, who lived in the house across the cemetery here, said that he had just caught a big rat, and we were so glad. The rat never came back, so we were glad that the rat got the rat from John Keenan. The flying squirrels were the most fun. They wintered in the walls of the parsonage and between the ceiling joists, and they played, it must have been some kind of extended winter tournament with the nuts that were stored there. Something like soccer or hockey or handball or pickleball or something, and only very, very late at night. Very noisy. Now, when I was still single, I was counseling a very emotionally imbalanced person. One of the most difficult counselors I think I've ever been involved with. And he had threatened me several times, physically threatened me. And one night I was started awake by a shattering crash. And my mental image was of a brick having been thrown through my front window. This is it, I thought. He's come for me. Well, I listened intently for a long time. I heard nothing else. Finally, I got the courage to get out of bed, and I turned on all the lights, and I went from room to room. I think I was carrying a big stick, looking for some sort of invader. And I had decorated a high window ledge in the dining room with an antique colored plate with the great preacher Henry Ward Beecher's bust on the plate. And so when I went into the dining room, there lay Beecher, shattered on the floor, and on the curtain rod, just over where the plate had been, a little flying squirrel was perched there. So the parsonage was a wonderful place to live. One quiet Sunday afternoon, my first January here in the old house, I thought my time had come again. I was back in the kitchen when a powerful, rumbling roar clattered the dishes in the cupboards, and it began shaking the whole house to its foundations. And I thought, the furnace is exploding, or it's a killer quake, even here in New Jersey. And I was just terrified, and I dashed out the front door, and as I dashed out, I jumped over a huge pile of ice and snow just on the front lawn. And I realized then what had happened. The roof then was still a slate roof. And when the afternoon sun began to warm the snow, it would slide off the slates en masse and thunder down onto the porch roof. And then it would transmit its force through the rafters of the porch roof to the amplifying frame of the house and scare the daylights out of it. Anyone who heard it was scared. I can't repeat here some of the alarmed expletives of frightened winter visitors over the years in that house. We loved the old house. There were no ghosts that we knew of. But I've already told you about the mice and the bats and the flying squirrels, all those denizens of the past. Louise and I were particularly fond of old houses. I fell in love with the parsonage the first time I ever saw it. What place could match its lovely setting here? No place. What stories could its low ceiling rooms, its wide sloping floors, its wavy glass windows tell. It's a great place to live. Olive Harness told me when I first moved in, she used to say, well, now the Presbyterian manse is elegant. That's elegant. Our parsonage is more of a farmhouse. Well, we were delighted with it. Herb Twitty, the pastor immediately following me, when he first looked at the house, he asked me confidentially, but seriously, he said, do you think the church would agree to moving this house to historic Waterloo Village and then build a new parsonage? No, I don't think so. This one is called Rummage Sales and Planting Time. Rummage sales and Lord's auctions were always exciting. You never knew, that is, what might turn up. There was lots of preparation work for these big sales. I remember a meeting at Swartzwood to plan a Lord's auction, which was to be held at the Swartzwood Firehouse. And it was going to be held there, and somebody suggested, this was weeks in advance, somebody suggested, well, there needs to be a place to drop off things before we can have the use of the firehouse for all this stuff. And it was Al Lorenzo, I believe. Al Lorenzo volunteered his garage for a drop-off place. And at the time, Harriet Parker spoke words of wisdom that I have never forgotten and that have saved me immeasurable work over the years. Harriet said, don't move it twice. You get it? Yeah. Don't move it twice. So I appreciate that advice. Well, April, let me back up. People had a habit, we had Lord's auctions, we had rummage sales, but people also had a habit, and they may still, I don't know, Nancy, but people had a habit of bringing things to the church that they didn't really need or want anymore in their house. But it wasn't quite something to throw out, and so maybe the church could use it, or maybe the church could sell it at a rummage sale. So anyway, I remember that when they were building the new addition on the church, Wayne McCabe and I cleaned basement closets, and we threw out no less than 16 stowed away, hand-me-down artificial Christmas trees. Well, sometimes, too, after the rummage sales, there were boxes of unsold clothes that would remain in the fellowship hall, big cardboard boxes, and they'd remain here sometimes for weeks or even months, much to the dismay of Catherine Huff, the organist, who liked everything neat and clean. Well, anyway, April was when I started planting my vegetable garden. And Catherine and Agnes Huff has told me once that I had the best garden since the Van Loons were here, and that was quite a compliment. But the deer got most of my garden the first year. So the second year I was here, I got some of the free deer repellent from the county extension office. It was a nasty, foul-smelling, dark, brown, concentrated, gooey liquid that you added water to, and you hung it all around on rags on the garden fence. It repelled both deer and people. And it was unspeakable stuff in there. Well, I didn't have any rags. I had all this repellent, but I didn't have any rags. And I thought, one of the boxes that are left over from the rummage sale. So I didn't open it over here, but I hauled it over to the garden. It's a heavy box, and I'm hauling it across the grass in the weather. When I got to the garden where my bucket of nasty deer repellent was, I opened it up, and it was full of underwear. Mostly women's underwear. Just the right size. Hang around the top wire of the garden. And so I used that, and as a bachelor pastor, my garden became the talk of the town. Alma and Fred Kishpaw lived down here right across the road. Choice people. You remember them very well. As a matter of fact, I believe it was your father, Edwin, who went to bat for them because they lived in a nice, well-kept trailer. And when they first moved here, the town committee didn't want any trailers in Stillwater. And your father talked about what fine people they were and that they would take good care of their place. And they did, and they were able to live there. So they lived there, and they were just choice people. And Alma cleaned the church early in the morning between the services. She would clean the church weekly. And Fred's dry humor always lightened the work. Well, one fall night, after an administrative board meeting, some of the members got tired of all these boxes here, and they decided to each one carry a box out and take it in their car and take it to the dump or somewhere else or something like that. Get rid of all of those bulging boxes of old rummage sale clothes that had been left over. Well, I saw Alma and Fred cleaning the church the next morning, and I came over and said hello, and Alma's eyes were twinkling, and she quizzed me. She said, "Hey, Larry, what were you doing at that meeting last night? I found this on the sidewalk this morning." She held up a woman's bra. So she held it up. And with that, Fred murmured. He said, "Well, if it was planting time, we'd have thought nothing of it." This one's called Paint Preferences. It was time to paint the parsonage. It had been many, many years since the last painting had been done, but in spite of the peeling paint, you could still see that the parsonage was done up with the God-ordained traditional Sussex County colors, white with dark green trim. All of the old farmhouses 50 years ago and before presented that way. But this was the 1970s. After the groundbreaking 1960s, new images were emerging. And white was again the chosen color for the siding. But for the trim, I selected, with board approval, I selected a color called Harvest Gold. It was a rather dark gold, almost a brown gold. The administrative board decided to hold a church-wide painting party. Even non-church folks participated. People brought ladders and scaffolding and brushes. The church bought the paint. A lunch was served, and the parsonage was painted on 2 consecutive Saturdays. I remember Bill Campbell from Swartzwood standing up on the porch roof, painting the 2nd story siding. Edwin Nelson was up on a ladder 3 stories high up in the peak of the gable, painting with no trepidation whatsoever. During lunch, his mother Ellen supplied us with delicious pie for snacks. And in 2 weekends, the house was painted. Well, early the next Sunday morning after the painting bee, I was in the parsonage, quietly putting my own finishing touches on my sermon. But I was startled by a loud cry on somebody, outside that is, somebody shouting, "Oh my God!" I rushed out onto the porch, and it was Catherine Huff, the organist. Her hands were on her hips. She was staring in open-mouthed horror at the parsonage. "What's the matter, Catherine?" "The paint." "You don't like the color?" "No." "Well, it's Harvest Gold." "Well, on the farm, we have another name for that color." This one's called the Firebird. When our son Daniel was born, we revised our wills, and our attorney astutely advised us that in the event we should die while Daniel was a minor, we should devise our will so that our estate would be apportioned to him in 3 segments when he reached the age of 21, 25, and 30. And then, with tongue-in-cheek, our attorney said that he himself was unusually bright and mature at the age of 21. But if someone had left him $50,000 at that age, he would have gone out and bought a Ferrari. Well, that's essentially what I did in my second year at Stillwater. I was 25 in 1972, and my grandfather had recently bequeathed me $5,000. And I spent $3,750 of it to buy my first new car, a 1973 Pontiac Firebird. It was the most beautiful car I had ever seen. It was metallic blue. It had a black interior. It was a real machine, the dealer said. It looked like it wanted to race. A single man's car, a statement. I was initially a little self-conscious driving it as a minister on conference minimum salary. And I remember parking it for the first time at the Sportswood Church and Fran Landgraf's asking, "Is that yours?" Well, it impressed the youth group. The old folks, too. Foster Harness was an inveterate car buff, and he made me promise that he would be the first to get to ride. May Siri, a widow from Middleville, way up in her 80s, had finally moved to an apartment house in Newton. And when I brought her out to visit her longtime best friend, Letha Robbins, May put on her best red dress. When they visited, when we came to the door, Letha said, "Why, May, you're all dressed up to see me?" "No," May said, "this is the first date I've had in a long time, and look at that car." Now, the police were impressed differently. I don't think profiling was in the vocabulary in the 1970s, but the police, they were doing it. Hot car equaled speeder. Well, one afternoon I was hurrying to conduct a funeral in Newton. I was on the Newton-Swartzwood, or the Swartzwood-Newton Road, and I stopped at that last stop sign just before you get into Newton, but maybe not completely. And when I got up to the park, the trooper pulled me over, and he was rough. He was already writing the ticket. "You ran that stop sign back there, you know, and you were flying. You want to kill somebody? You do that again, we'll take your license." So he was writing the ticket. After a little while, he said, "So you live in Stillwater. You work around here?" I said, "Yes, I'm the pastor of the Stillwater Methodist Church, and I'm almost late for a funeral I'm supposed to conduct." He looked stunned. "Why didn't you tell me that before?" "I've already written this, but I'm going to change it to a burned out brake light. You take it easy now." Well, Louise didn't like the car at all. Our first meeting was a setup. After her mother and Aunt Mabel had first met me, they reportedly went home and announced to Louise, "Have we got the man for you?" Well, Louise said that when I came to dinner for the first time driving the Firebird and wearing a big flashy college ring, she wasn't at all so sure. Well, the car quickly lost its charm. It was so low slung that the front end would hit the bumps on the Stillwater-Blairstown Road as you went over to Blairstown. And within 2 years, the sides of the car had rusted out beyond redemption. I was lucky to find a buyer for it, someone younger and less wise. Well, this one's called "What People Say on the Way Out of Church." The most important time of the week for the congregation and the pastor may be when people leave church. Think about it. It's the one time when all the people are gathered together in one place, and yet each one has a chance to speak to the minister going out the door. Now, I still remember my first Sunday, I was overwhelmed with the requests for visits and appointments, news of who who was sick, how much was due on the fuel bill. Teachers were still needed for the vacation Bible school, etc., etc. All these concerns expressed. Input overload for me. It was essentially an assembly line of all of the concerns in the church. It was an important time, but a very dangerous time, because for me, it was the point of the week that I was least equipped to process all those things. Preaching, my grandfather used to say, preaching is exhausting in the extreme. And I was burned out at noon on Sundays. Sometimes I put my foot in my mouth, as you shall see. But I do remember a lot of things people said to me as I shook hands. Now, the standard greeting was, I enjoyed your sermon. And then, not that that's insincere, but it's the more or less ritual way of saying hello to the pastor on your way out. For some, there were add-ons. Ken Roberts always gave me a big bear hug on his way out of the church. Lily McGill, bless her Irish soul, never failed to give me a big smoochy kiss. And it was always very nice, but it left me wondering what to do when the next woman came along. When I preached a challenging sermon, Dot Boehm always said, that was a zinger. After similar sermons, there was another woman, a regular Swartzwood Lake summer visitor, and she would very animatedly shake my hand and say, go and do! On the uncommon Sunday that Don Robbins said, good sermon, Larry, I knew that it had been an exceptional one for some reason, because he never offered praise lightly. Well, not all my sermons were good or well advised. One time I preached a one-sided sermon on abortion, arguing for the value of pro-choice. And a couple who had tried unsuccessfully for years to have children, and who finally, in later years, were blessed with two, simply passed by shaking their heads. Another time I preached on the greater importance of social action as opposed to individual religion. And Roberta Bunker and Elsie Phillips, who worked with disadvantaged children down in Plainfield, told me that I was dead wrong, that inculcating moral character and faith in individuals is the only sure foundation of the kingdom. Well, as I said, I was tired at noon on Sundays. Sometimes I was on what you would say automatic pilot when greeting people coming through the line. Helen Williams one Sunday. Helen Williams took my hand and confided that her doctor had recently given her disturbing news about her heart condition. You look fine to me, Helen, I said, passing on to the next person who was coming. It was only later that afternoon that my unfeeling words came ringing back to me, and I called Helen and I said, I apologize for what I said, and explained that I just was tired and wasn't thinking. And she said, I did think what you said was rather strange, but she said she graciously forgave me. One time a woman took my hand, but she was also herself, as she shook my hand, she was shaking all over and she appeared near collapse. She could hardly speak. She said, where were you yesterday? I said, well, here working on my sermon. Should I have been somewhere? She said, performing my daughter's wedding. I had held two premarital counseling sessions with her daughter and her son. I remember that. I told the person to go over immediately to the parsonage porch and wait till after church and we would talk. So I remember performing those two premarital counseling sessions, and the deal was that it was an ecumenical wedding, and they were to then meet with the priest, and when they decided on a date, which hadn't been decided yet, the priest was to call me and let me know the date. And no one ever called me. Now, this churches began doing ecumenical services. So when I explained that I had never been told what day the wedding was, it was okay. Finally, dear Catherine Huff, our organist, I had stopped by her farm the day before to get eggs. But neither I nor the Huffs that particular Saturday afternoon, the day before Sunday, had any change, and so they let me take the eggs on credit. I guess they were probably 75 cents. The next day, Sunday, after the postlude, Catherine came through the line and demanded, "You can pay me what you owe me if you have it." So, when people come through and leave church, it's an important but a dangerous time. This is called pastoral cares. The old folks, God rest their souls, they love to work, and they judged you by how hard you worked. Ministers were always suspect. What real work do ministers do? Pop Nelson and his father and Jake Emmons and others of their generation were locally renowned for the amount of work they could do. Pop Nelson, who was a master builder and repairman, he used to claim that he had worked on nearly every building in Stillwater at some point. Once I was telling Jake Emmons about the excellent job that a carpenter, Larry Strang, had done at the parsonage. Excellent work. And Jake replied, "He does good work, but holy God is he slow." And another time the church held a painting party to spruce up the interior of the church here. And Pop and Jake in their 70s put up scaffolding all across this front wall here. And they had the whole wall painted before the rest of us had hardly begun to do anything. Jim White used to mow the grass out here for the church. And he confided to me that during a previous minister's pastorate, Pop stopped him one day and gestured toward the parsonage and asked, "Why isn't he mowing the grass?" Well, a minister's work is never done. It may not always be painting or mowing. I remember a particular week in which I held 3 funerals, performed a wedding, plus counseled several people in crisis. It was a week that sorely tested my limits. I was spent. And it was a sunny Friday afternoon, early summer, and before trying to gather my energy up to prepare my Sunday sermon, I decided to put on shorts and just soak up a little sun and de-stress. So I was lying on the grass on the far side of the parsonage when I heard car tires on the gravel road coming down from Ellen and Pop Nelson's, and it was Dot and Jean Galusha, some of their best friends. And as they passed by, Jean called out the window, "Working hard today?" Here's one called Stillwater Lore and Place Names. In my first conversations with folks here in Stillwater, I heard new words, or maybe I should say some very old words. The senior generation and some not so senior still used words, pronunciations, figures of speech from bygone German, Dutch, and English dialects. And some words were just plain different. For instance, people didn't grow peonies, they grew pineys. And people didn't have a heart attack, they had a heart attack. Here are some others. Beautiful was pronounced beautiful. I'm going to mention names here. That was Ellen Nelson. Nothing was pronounced nothing. The O drawn out and pronounced like the O in hot or not. Nothing. All of the old folks pronounced it that way. Auction was pronounced auction. That was Walt Chamning's. The minister was sometimes called the dominie. The dominie, an old Dutch and Scottish term for meaning originally Lord. The dominie, that was Alvin Waldron and Walt Chamning's. Kind deeds were not thoughtful, they were thoughty. Thoughty, that was Pearl Castor Monroe and Ellen Nelson. Instead of asking, what kind of dog is that? Some folks ask, what for kind of dog is that? What for kind of dog is that? Remember that? And this came from the old German, was für ein, that meant what kind of. And they would put it in front of what kind, and that was Alma and Fred Kishpaw. What for kind of dog is that? The Delaware River was the Delaver. The Delaver. There were various words used to denote things without a name or a list of things. Things not listed, like whatnot, and whatnot. That was the Huffs. Dingus, some sort of dingus. That was Victor and Donna Robbins. And such. That was Randy Snook. And the best one of all, like that there. Like that there. That was Annie Lucy and Sam Kastner. So here's a summary. I found this dingus in a box of whatnot. It isn't beautiful. They're good for nothing, I guess. What for kind of place shall I send it? Oh, I'll toss it in the Delaware, or somewhere like that there. No, I'll give it to the Dominie, and he'll sell it at the Lord's auction and say that's very thoughty of me and such. Some forgotten lore of the area. On one Saturday, I remember Don Kastner, the marvelous auctioneer from Branchville, and he was auctioning off the Joe Emmons estate. And Virginia Spangenberg, she was a good friend of the Emmons, and I think maybe even lived with Jake and Leela toward the end of their life. But Virginia Spangenberg was there, and Virginia had forgotten to get a paddle with a number on it to hold up when you bid on something. And so a helper called out, "Who bought that? Who bought that?" And someone answered, "Virginia Spangenberg." Whereupon auctioneer Kastner chanted, "Down from the mountain comes the thundering herd. It's the God-forsaken Spangenberg." and I don't know what Virginia Spangenberg thought, but years later I recited it to Louise's Uncle Danny, who lived to be over 100 up here in Harvard, and he recited another whole verse. But when they went back, a year later, he couldn't remember it anymore. So it's lost. I checked with Don Kastner. He said he learned it at Newton High School when he was a student in the 1940s, and that it was about the numerous Spangenberg tribe who lived on top of Kidshenny Mountain, and they would come down off the mountain to get their weekly provisions. So down from the mountain comes the thundering herd, the God-forsaken Spangenberg. Place names. Where did the name of the beautiful ridge behind the church here, Pompey Ridge, right? You all know Pompey, up on Old Pompey, people would say, Pompey Ridge. Where did that come from? The old-timers refer to it as up on old Pompey. It's not from the Pompeii of volcanic fame. I've read several times of African-American slaves named Pompey. There's an early American fiddle tune called Pompey's March, but no one seems to know where the name came from. There's a field called Egypt. It used to be called Egypt, way out in the woods on the Stillwater-Hardwick line. If you'll take the old wood road on the upper side of Catfish Pond and walk past, where Wendy and Jeff Guthrie lives, or live, and you walk past that for a long time until you're really tired, you'll come out to a lovely field surrounded by swamps and limestone cobbles. And it was worked by the Maines and the Cook families a century ago, and they called it Egypt because it was so far away. Rosie's Rock is a big limestone rock outcropping that towers above a field just about on the Swartzwood-Hampton line on the Myrtle Grove Road. And Gerald Kastner could have told you just where it was. But Lulu Kastner said that when Rosie's love went unrequited, she jumped off the rock and landed in the trees below, and there were two farm hands in the field, And they witnessed her leap, and one said, "There goes Rosie." And the other one said, "It's too late now." Immortal lines. Immortal lines. We've got about 10 minutes more, just to let you know.
What about the white cover?
Well, we can answer some questions afterwards. I want to go through a few more. You all probably remember one or two favorite birthdays in the past. I remember two particular ones. One was when I was 10 years old, when my parents took me and my sister to Philadelphia to my aunt and uncle, and we went to Independence Hall, and we heard orations, and we had a picnic on the Schuylkill River. And then that evening, we went over to Delaware and watched fantastic fireworks at one of the DuPont estates. That was my first favorite birthday.
What's your birthday?
My birthday, thank you. My birthday is July 4th. So yes, thank you. Anyway, July 4th. So that was my first favorite birthday. The second one was my bicentennial birthday, which was here in Stillwater, and it was so much fun. I got to preach, because it fell on a Sunday, I got to preach here Sunday morning on my birthday, and I brought a family heirloom Revolutionary War sword to show and use as an example. And my sermon, I'm sure, affirmed love of country, but it held that all of our loyalties ultimately stand under the judgment and mercy of God. The tone of the service, if I may say so, was stirring. It was stirring. The place was packed until the offering. I offered a prayer of dedication, and the ushers passed the plates to the overflow crowd here. Catherine Huff sang "God Bless America," and it just shook the chandelier, and it was better than Kate Smith could have done. But afterward, the introductory chord for the doxology, it wasn't right. And as the ushers marched forward with the brimming offering plates, the congregation belted out, "Happy birthday to you."
Remind me to tell you about Catherine Huff.
This one is called "No Golden Arches Here." Lunch at the Hardwick House. A hamburger, cup of coffee, and a double scoop dish of Welsh Farms chocolate ice cream. That was my standard order at the Hardwick House, which was down here at Squire's Corner. It no longer stands. It was demolished and removed 15 years ago or more. I frequented the Hardwick House most often for lunch. It was away from the very busy pace of Stillwater. And actually, lunch home as a bachelor was lonesome. It was tedious trying to figure out what to have for lunch. So I would go to the Hardwick House, just a few miles away, and I always took a table in the sunny bay window, facing the road and the horse pasture opposite it. And the table was close to the bar, so I could listen to the interesting conversation going on at the bar. And it wasn't too many weeks of my going there until the regulars at the bar got more relaxed about knowing that a pastor was sitting right over here within earshot, and so they stopped their initial guardedness then. The place was run, the proprietors, were Barton and Peg Hull. Barton and Peg Hull. Barton, I know some of you remember Bart Hull. He was one great guy. He was not tall, but he was at least 300 pounds. He was a congenial bartender, a wonderful storyteller, but he had a short fuse. The word had it that sometimes he bounced people with his stomach. Peg, his wife, was an excellent and long-suffering cook. And thin as a laugh, she was the counterpart to Bart. They weren't regular church people, but they respected religion where it was authentic. Bart was a descendant of the Stillwater Wintermutes, the Wintermute pioneers here, and he had a juicy stock of local character anecdotes, some about unsavory clergy that I can't repeat. He never minced words. One time I parked my newly purchased second-hand Toyota station wagon in front of the bay window. "Whose Toyota is that?" he demanded. He had seen action in the South Pacific with the Marines in World War II. "It's mine," I said. "How many of those blankety-blank Japanese put money in your offering plate each Sunday?" he said. Another day, a couple of newcomers sat down at the bar and they ordered lunch. And after waiting a long, long time, one of them rather timidly asked about their order. "You don't see no golden arches here," barked Bart. "If you want quicker service, go find some." In our family, ever since then, if we say, "You don't see no golden arches here," that means we've been waiting a long time. Bart was rough, but he had a soft heart. He had a pet English bulldog that always lay next to the bar and resembled him in size. The dog could barely walk, but it waddled into the inn early every morning to be fed by the workers before Bart came downstairs. One cold January day, the dog didn't show up. Fearing that the dog was dead, Bart would not come downstairs until they found it, which they did later in the day, sleeping in a warm window well. Well, we grew very fond of Bart and Peg. Their son went through confirmation class here at Harmony Hill. He was confirmed here at this altar. Once Peg generously drove Louise all the way to class at Seton Hall in South Orange when our car broke down. Oh, the Harvey House is gone. As if no one can take the place of Bart and Peg. God rest their souls. I've got to read 3 more. Is that all right?
Yeah.
What will people remember about us years hence? It seems that our eccentricities live on in stories long after our normal traits or even our good deeds are forgotten. Parishioners enjoy telling their pastors about the quirks of preacher predecessors. One of mine was a pastor named Neil Van Loon. I never met him. As it happens, he was a college buddy of my uncle. So I knew about him. I'd heard about him, but these stories were never told me. By my uncle, he didn't know them. These stories were told by his flock who survived them. And thank God that God remembers the good and the noble of our lives, and it refines it forever in his eternal kingdom. Van Loon was a pastor of the Stillwater Sportswood churches during most of the 1950s. He served longer, I think, than any other pastor, except me and Sam Chong and hopefully Pastor Nancy. He was a big man. He was over 6 feet tall. These are just stories that were told me. I never met him. Over 6 feet tall. He always wore a 10-gallon hat. He loved the West. For some reason, he and his wife declined to live in the parsonage over here. They bought a house on the edge of Johnsonburg, where he transformed a large limestone cobble. That's one of those natural outcrops of limestone. He transformed it into a spectacular rock garden. He was noted for his flowers. And as a matter of fact, there are still peonies. I saw them the other day. There's still peonies on the lawn of the former Garris house downtown that were given to them by Van Loon probably over 70 years ago. Great gardener. He reportedly loved symbolism. In Sportswood, he remodeled the sanctuary. He removed the front cross, and he constructed a fountain on the altar. I saw the copper tubing remnants in the Sportswood attic when I was here. And it had this fountain had a central jet representing Christ, and then the water splashed down into a pan and ran out of 12 smaller spouts representing the 12 apostles. And as soon as the church service began, they would turn on this fountain. And someone told me that as soon as it got turned on, all the little kids immediately would leave to go to the bathroom. People told me about a gorgeous original chandelier that hung in the Sportswood Sanctuary. It was a large wheel with a dozen beautiful brass-shaded oil lamps. It was sold to George Huffmeister over here during the Van Loon remodeling. It was too old-fashioned for Van Loon. Hoffmeister had long since sold it when I arrived here. Uncle Ray Maines was the preeminent historian of Harmony Church. He remembered stories and genealogies and a myriad of details that no one else did. He had written it all down. Ellen Nelson said it was a thick volume, and he had loaned it to Van Loon. It lay for months on the back seat of his car. And one day, Mrs. Van Loon cleaned the car and threw it out. It was the only copy. It has never been rewritten, of course. Van Loon's bedside manner was also one of a kind. Sonny Clowater, pillar of the Sportswood Church, was very ill with pneumonia in Newton Hospital. And he recalled that Van Loon came to see him, and before he left, Van Loon said, "You know, Sonny, if it gets in your other lung, it's curtains." Well, one of all Van Loon's innovations I wish still existed. It was he who started the practice of the congregation singing every Sunday at the close of worship, "God be with you till we meet again," after the benediction. And I don't know when that tradition was deemed no longer worthy, but I shall never sing that hymn without a flood of fond memories of my first pastorate. Let me do two more. This one is a quote from the Gospel of Luke. "He has filled the hungry with good things." Between Thanksgiving and Christmas, our church always delivered food baskets and gifts to the needy in Stillwater. I always had ambivalent feelings about it. Why show concern for the poor only at the holidays? What about the old wisdom, it's better to teach a person to fish than to give them a fish? It bothered me that the church could do so little to address the systemic causes of poverty. And sometimes a church member would ask, is this family really trying to better themselves or just freeloading? And that question betrayed a misunderstanding of the gospel of unconditional love. But we always gave the gifts. And at the very least, the giving was symbolic of the work of Christ, foretold in Mary's song of praise, "He has filled the hungry with good things." And the gifts were a tangible sign of the perfect plenty in the coming kingdom of God. I still remember the man in the rented trailer up the road crying as I gave him Christmas toys to give to his children. Sorry. And I remember taking food to Ethel Utter. Ethel, who was in late middle age, and her widowed mother, Gracie, had always been poor. Years before, Gracie's husband had worked with the local road crews. And after he died, Ethel and her mother eked out a living, raising their own food and tending a few sheep that were just really pets rather than income. And when their house burned, this was up on the corner of Hardwick and Mount Holly Road. When their house burned, Gracie and Ethel, who were fiercely independent and suspicious, always suspicious of help, they moved in with their sheep in a crude lean-to there. Well, some townspeople quietly raised money for materials, and Pop Nelson graciously built a cozy, tiny cottage for the two. When I conducted Gracie's funeral not long afterward, I met other family members who lived far away, and they seemed completely conventional. Ethel was a simple soul. Short, plump, hair braided in a bun. Deprived of schooling, she was wary of and curt with outsiders, but she was essentially kind. She walked everywhere she went. Her life was measured not by clocks and calendars, but by the natural seasons of her little woodland world at the corner of Mount Holly and Hardwick Roads. When did she move here? Well, it was when she was a child, just as the first apple blossoms were coming on. Ethel did house cleaning for Ellen Nelson and also walked 8 miles to Newton to clean for others. Ellen employed Ethel more out of goodness than for Ethel's thoroughness at housework. Concerned that Ethel needed a steady income, Ethel's daughter, Jeanette Gagliano, Edwin's sister, who worked at Newton Hospital, Jeanette and I met with the director of the hospital, and he was ready to give Ethel a regular job. I took her to the interview, and I remember well standing behind her chair. She was sitting in front of me, facing the director of the hospital. I was facing him from behind, and I remember that very well. And both of us faced the director as he asked her questions. And a few minutes into the interview, Ethel interrupted him and asked, "Does this mean that I would be cleaning rooms after sick people have been in them?" "Yes," the director said. Ethel sat up straight and declared, "Well, then you can take your job," and his eyes got real big, "and give it to someone else." The last time I saw Ethel, she was walking in Freedom on her way to clean a house in Newton. I stopped and gave her a ride, and I remember her expressing concern about Ellen Nelson's health. This one's called Elsa's Stars. Christmas comes at the darkest time of the year, and for good reason. We need to see the light. Life is difficult. At Christmas, I especially think of Elsa Klein, a steadfast member of the Swartzwood and later the Harmony Hill Church. She and her dear friend Frida Reeves moved to Virginia many years ago. Elsa came to America from Germany after the Second World War. A more honest and forthright person I have never known. She was good through and through. All her life, she was haunted by her experiences of the war in which her fiancé was killed. I'll never forget the quizzical look she would give me every time we sang the hymn, "Glorious things of thee are spoken, glorious things of thee are spoken, Zion, city of our God." Well, that is the tune of the old German national anthem. And Elsa would always get big-eyed and give me a look. But there's more to the story. She was at her core conflicted by the problem of evil. Never fully able to resolve the question of why the world suffers if God is good and all-powerful. Who can answer it? None of us. For Elsa, the question couldn't stay on the back burner. She was no Pollyanna. She looked at the fallenness of creation with a clear and realistic eye. But there's more to the story. There's a saying, and it's the motto of the Christopher Society. It's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. In her best moments, Elsa lit candles. If you realized what a momentous event it was when she walked to the front and joined the Swartzwood Church. It was a giant leap of faith from a damaged past. And where Elsa saw good, she always supported it with unstinted loyalty and generosity. One one example. For years, she contributed to the missionary work of former pastor Tony Fadley by fashioning and selling miniature churches, little miniature outhouses, and letter holders. Many of us still have those things. One of Elsa's cousins was a German nun, and every Christmas she mailed Elsa traditional German tree ornaments that she made herself, exquisite stars that were just intricately cut and stitched together from pieces of straw. And every Christmas, Elsa gave them to us. We have 27 of them. And as we hang them at Christmas time, we think again of Elsa and the choice we each have between the darkness and the light. Well, this last one is called Store Stories. There were 4 venerable interconnected institutions in Stillwater when I was pastor. There was the Presbyterian Church and Garris's store, owned by Presbyterians Harold and Doris Garris. There was the Methodist Church and Robin's store, owned by Methodists Donald and Shirley Robbins. All four of those places seemed eternal. They had been there forever. They were the fabric and lore of the town. Growing up in the suburbs, knowing only supermarkets, I especially appreciated the intimate human scale of those two businesses. They each had their own distinctive ambience. Since the parsonage was closest to Garris's store, if I needed a quart of milk, I would go there. But if I needed some obscure nut or bolt, I would go to Robin's store, and Shirley and Don would always find it. Harold Garris was talking to me one day, and he said this. He said, sometimes people come into my store, and they argue to the point of insults, but they're back the next day. He said, those same people can come into church, and if someone so much as looks sideways at them, they never come back. What do you make of that? Well, the stores were local gathering spots. And when I had been pastor for several years, I generally knew everyone I encountered there, and except on weekends, most of the people who drove by the store in their cars. And one weekday last summer, I had a strange and sobering experience. I sat on the porch of Garris's store for a full half hour eating my lunch. And I didn't know one soul who entered the store or passed by. I was Rip Van Winkle. This had been my parish. Now I knew no one, or so it seemed. A lesson in humility and transience. There's a one-sentence prayer of the great medieval monk, St. John of the Cross. And it puts the years of our lives in a secure perspective. And here it is, one sentence. Well and good if all things change, Lord God, provided we are rooted in you. I'd like us to join together in singing. We've all got hymnals. I'd like us to join together in singing hymn number 672, a hymn loved in the tradition of